Today we talk about the donation of Constantine, which is a very interesting topic out of early medieval history and in the history of the Roman Church. And probably many of you already know what the donation of Constantine was, at least as a document. It wasn't really called that way, but it is largely known through this, through the meaning of its content, at least. So it's pretty clear what we were referring to, which is the it was the a diplom that was written, in fact, during the early Middle Ages in order to it was a gift in which it was witnessed, historically speaking, theoretically, because the document had been created as in order to be presented as a proof that the Roman Emperor Constantine had donated to the Church of Rome, to the popes especially, in this sense, in perspective, the power over very large parts of the Roman Empire, and we will be seeing that in detail, which is a false document, a fake document that had been fabricated in order to achieve certain goals. And this is not a video really to criticize, what the Roman Church was doing at that time. Here I talk about history, and I don't have any factionality, any preference towards anyone. I'm not pushed by ideological reasons. And the donation of Constantine, to me, it's an extremely fascinating topic because it tells you so much, not much about these critics that you can move to the Roman Church in the Middle Ages for what it was building up, propagandistically speaking, over a fake document, but the same reason of why this document was created at that point, and contextualizing it in the in fact in the European situation of that time relatively to the church, the Western Church, but also to more worldly events and nets of of relations between kings, bishops, the Pope, and so on in Western Christianity. And this, in fact, this context is what we're gonna mostly talk about relatively to this topic. For one reason that that was actually quite concrete, because as you know, during the Carolingian age, there was this revival of an empire that, in spite of the legitimization of the process, had to at least go into the footsteps of the old Western Roman Empire. The Carolingians objectively had a huge power. They didn't think of themselves as Romans proper. The Franks had their own very strong identity, but they did accept the title of Roman emperors from the Pope's hand, which obviously gave a lot of prestige to them, and it was also a way to say, hey, look what we are doing. We are Germans. We are the ones who, at least defeated the Romans, if anything, over time, and now we are the guys who get imperial dignity. So, and this whole idea, it was a huge ideology surrounding this idea that obviously was also not very well defined, because the crowning of Charles the Great in Rome in the night of Christmas night of 800 AD was was an extremely important moment indeed, but it also reflected since the very beginning the ambiguities that existed relatively to this renewed imperial dignity and the fact that the Church of Rome was searching from a new protector from the usual Byzantine and therefore see Roman Empire, and a lot of discrepancies between uh, the perspectives through which this crowning had been seen, because obviously the popes were pushing for obtaining a lot of power on their own through this crowning. They basically asked even the Franks to let him rule all over substantially almost all of Italy at that time, while the Carolingians obviously believed that that this crowning sanctioned a situation of a condition of force that was recognized by the by the church, and that was reinforced. It was meant to reinforce their political power and therefore even the same control over the Roman Church. And there was a lot of infighting. Now, as we know, while the the Roman Church keeps living to this day, the Carolingian Empire finished a bit before, and in this process, obviously, it didn't happen all of a sudden. And considering Rome and the situation, even the political situation of Italy and of the same Carolingian Empire, you see that it was a quite peripheral area, of this mostly Central European empire. And the popes could really play a lot of, their political cards in Rome. Imagine that, I don't know, if the popes had lived in Aachen, at the Carolingian court, things would have been radically different. At this time, even the geographical distance obviously played a part, because the Pope could play on many aspects, on many aids that could arrive from the Franks themselves, from the Byzantines, from the local Italian aristocracy, even the same Roman aristocracy up to a certain extent. And generally speaking, the Carolingian Empire eventually collapsed, and it was, it declined for a long time. So this is the moment in which Rome, through the connections that obviously she had with the rest of the Western Church, was playing her cards also from an ideological and propagandistical point of view, as we were saying, and for reasons that were, quite not just theoretical. And the donation of Constantine, that is often, people often make fool of the ingenuity of this text, because it asks for impossible demands, and it's so historically incorrect, and it's so blatantly fake. But I think that this document at the same time is extremely important for understanding the dynamics that moved the relationship between Rome and the churches that were elsewhere in Western Europe, so even in the lands of the empire, of the Carolingian Empire. And therefore this had very meaningful consequences for the relationship between state and church into that empire, as well as in the other political entities that were formed, formed through them. And the main point in here has not really much to do with the donation Constantine wasn't much of an ideological fight against the Carolingians. I mean, this donation, as we said, was asking the Church of was asking the imperial power that now the popes had identified with the Franks, to be returned that worldly power that had been granted according to this fake donation by the same imperial authority back in the 4th century. And it was a huge power, we'll be seeing that. So one could naively think that it was mainly a sort of weapon to threaten the Carolingian Empire with this with this donation, with this demand, um, and you would think that these people back in the day would be so naive. Telling the truth, the donation of Constantine wasn't even at the base of what was eventually, asked by the popes to the Franks. The Franks, as we the popes demanded essentially this hegemony over Italy that was still part of what would be eventually written in the donation of Constantine, but they never asked in fact, and they never used the donation of Constantine as as a sort of menace or threat to the political stability of the empire, not even when the Ottonians came in the presence of other emperors. The donation of Constantine was really much was used also from a political point of view in from this very moment, but besides the fact that it has a very obscure origin, because we don't know exactly where and when it was written, and why and by whom, and in which, and therefore, and that is quite meaningful to understand the genetic reasons for which it had been written. That, let's say that at a certain point it floated around. It was used, as much as even and recognized by certain emperors. But it's not that it would be actually believed, or what was written in it ever had concrete consequences in terms of the papal and imperial relationship substantially speaking. I think the time in which it was mainly propagandized was during the 13th century, when the Church of Rome already had a huge power on her own. She was at the peak of her power all over Europe, and therefore they could wave this document together with others in order to strengthen ideologically what hadn't been already strengthened politically and factually speaking. But the objective that this the aim that this document already telling the truth was had a target within the same ecclesiastical organization. It was something created to obtain immediately something from emperors. Look, Constantine gave us this. Now, if you want to be up equal to Constantine, you have to do that. No, also because the Franks would have never done such a thing. It was really an ideological tool, as many others, by the way, that probably haven't even survived, and that were probably written in many ways. We don't have to think about the donation of Constantine as something that was created at that moment, even as a sort of unicum. We probably were so many other, and I think that are historically witnessed so many other documents that had a similar function, that were produced at that time as well as before, probably, or even and then obviously later. But the real point, the real objective of this document was limiting the authority of the metropolitic seats. Now, what does this mean? It means simply this, that the Church of Rome, thanks to the Carolingian Empire, extended farther over many other European churches her power. Because obviously the Franks were favoring Rome and the popes, that were already quite influential on their own, but they didn't have a political preeminence over the various other churches scattered all over the Carolingian Empire. And this is a situation that they obviously exploited as such. Now, the major rivals to the Church of Rome at this very moment were the other metropolitic seat. Rome was a metropolitic seat as well. Metropolitic seats were essentially those big churches, like at the time in Constantine could be I don't know, Alexandria of Egypt, Jerusalem, Constantinople, obviously, but that came later. Antioch and these other, and Rome, of course. But the metropolitic asset had also evolved, and there was a hierarchy within the same bishoprics. There were certain, maybe certain preeminences that hadn't been really sanctioned, but I mean, if you look at Gaul, for instance, where the Franks were ruling, obviously there were a preeminence of a certain church over another, because historically speaking, those churches had even expanded from a political point of view. The bishops who had ruled them back in the Merovingian times were more like local lords than bishops, so there was a sort of certification, and were definitely certain dioceses that were depending from another one that was bigger and that highly influenced them in many ways. That was still part of the hierarchical frame that had been set at the times of Constantine himself. But obviously at this time, when the Carolingians were trying to put the papacy higher in order to strengthen the legitimacy of their papal crowning, um, the popes started to have ambitions against, those major archbishops that were extremely powerful and had a lot of political influence all over the surrounding areas. And we don't have to go that far to see, how the major rivals of these of the Pope could be, because Rome had a great rival in Ravenna, which is a northern Italian town. At that time was a big city considering the times. And there was an archbishop there who basically said that, Rome didn't have any, primacy over the other churches, because effectively it was not the case. I mean, metropolitic seats had been created just for a sort of organizational reason. Basically, it was a hierarchy that was meant to make things work in the various smaller dioceses, but it's not that the Bishop of Rome was inherently more politically influent than all the other bishops that made up the Christian world. And yet, and obviously this was the major, the major point in which certain clergymen, powerful clergymen, such like the Archbishop of Ravenna would push on, for stemming the ambitions of the Pope. But at the same time, they would be trying to, to strengthen their metropolitic role, exactly as the Roman bishop was doing, to say, we are a metropolitic seat, or at least we are an archbishopric, and so on. And therefore we have a power that has to be granted to us. Roma, the Roman Church and the Church of Ravenna were quite close, geographically speaking. There was a lot of antagonism exactly because of that. But however, as I was saying, the papal focus was rapidly expanding up to those churches that were ruled by the in the world Carolingian Empire, but even in the Anglo-Saxon world, and even the churches in the north of Spain that had survived to the Muslim invasions, and so on, everything into the western half of Europe. And in this fight against the metropolites, obviously the objective of Rome was to stress the primacy of Rome, the preeminence of Rome over all the churches of Christianity. So obviously these metropolitic seats, or these archbishops that felt to be superior to the other bishops had to be as major figures of the Christian hierarchy to be subjected to the same Pope of Rome. And obviously such a document like the donation of Constantine was exactly meant to achieve that, to show that the Church of Rome was not just the first, it didn't have the primacy over all the other churches of the globe, because Saint Peter and Saint Paul had been martyrized in Rome, and therefore it was the holy city for pro excellence. But through the donation, Rome was claiming a political power, so an earthly, a worldly, mundane power to exercise even with force in a certain measure over the whole churches of Christianity, and this was quite meaningful. Now, who were the papal allies in this process? Well, obviously were the minor bishops. I mean, the hierarchy, according to the papal view, would be bishops, archbishops, papacy, in reverse. And obviously the bishops, they were sometimes vexed by archbishops, because archbishops were in fact extremely, powerful in their own regions, and they would keep these dioceses down with all the relative bishops, would see in the Pope, a very great help in order to reduce the metropolitic power and the power of archbishops in practice. So obviously bishops were pushing for that. And they were pushing also for another reason, that within the Carolingian Empire, as we've been saying in other videos, there was a great importance given to the clergymen. There were bishops and abbots that belonged to the most prestigious Frankish aristocracy, and to whom the same Carolingian kings would entrust the very large properties in order to make them, to save them from aristocracy and from lay aristocracy, and to try to build a sort of national church that could exist as a sort of parastatal entity opposed to the power of nobility. But this also implied that the bishops had to be tied to the royal power, which in some cases obviously were happy to do, because royal power granted them rights and securities and so on. But at the same time, the fact that the Pope would claim such rights over the bishops that certain times were very far away, so Rome didn't have at that moment extremely powerful means to exercise, and to decide matters in those dioceses. Well, this idea was quite advantageous for the bishops as well, because they thought, if we establish a good relationship with the Pope, we don't have to obey to the local archbishop. We are also partly freer from the royal ingerence, because the Pope will also communicate with kings and make their own policies on the base of the fact that in that moment the Carolingian kings were had a legitimacy as such, thanks to the Pope. So the various bishops of the West would start seeing this relationship with Rome as a good opportunity to counter the royal and archiepiscopal power. And at the same time, obviously, this meant, on the other side, that there would be an alliance between the kings and archbishops, for many reasons, because obviously these archbishops were already quite important, as we've seen, and they were part of the high aristocracy of the Frankish establishment. They would already have very important roles in the administration of the kingdom. They were those who had, in this sense, more to lose from a weakening of royal power. So there was a sort of balance between these two parts, the Pope and the bishops, and the kings and the archbishops, in order to, in this political game that was mostly played by within the same ecclesiastical elites, but that had obviously direct consequences also in politics broadly meant, and even in the fate of the empire. Um, and therefore the donation of Constantine um, was created in order to show, as we've seen, um, 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 you know, to well, sorry, I got a bit distracted. I meant that you have to think at that time that there wasn't an official church. Hmm? The idea of a church like in the 13th century, in which the Pope ruled everything. It had contacts with all um, the bishops, with a very strictly, regulated diplomatical contact and practices for which popes could influence the election of bishops, etc. wasn't there. This is a quite primitive stage in that phase, because this is the moment in which the Church of Rome started to build up her power from that point of view. And however, there was still the idea from the Roman Empire of ecumenical councils that would be the place where all the bishops of Christianity met to decide things. Now, with the shrinking of the Byzantine Empire, with the rise of the Carolingian Empire, and the political fragmentation of Europe, obviously there had been a spread during the early Middle Ages of many local councils that would settle ecclesiastical matters on their own, that would even develop different rites and different liturgy, and there wasn't much of a unity in this sense. However, there were some there was still the idea that what was deliberated in such councils had a sort of ecumenical importance, or at least that it could be used eventually in an ecumenical council to to obtain new prerogatives. And what happened is that local churches in this play began to build worlds on their own that were in fact based on many fakes, such like the donation Constantine, but there was a myriad of them, and some of them were called the so-called Decretals, that were normally would be better known as something that were eventually signed by the Pope, but here there was a lot of fakening also from this point of view. And the donation of Constantine emerged in this sense from was inserted within the Pseudo-Isidorian Decretals that was produced around the mid of the 9th century, seemingly as we will be seeing in the northeast of France, and that were meant to be these group of documents that would reinforce the certain local prerogatives, or certain prerogatives that belong in this sense to the Pope. So it was something very mixed, very confused, and even historically speaking, these are extremely difficult things to study. You need very great specialists who can study and understand, because decretals were put all together you find these collections of documents from various ages that, however, were put all together because they all represented, the various things that you had from the past that could, favor, that could make you obtain a certain right, or that were telling you that you had certain, I don't know, gifts from a certain church, from an archbishop, from the pope, and that you could boast theoretically in a council by saying, look, these are true, these are things that were, I don't know, signed by that pope in that century, and this tells here that this land belongs to this church, to my church, obviously. and they were and that they were and sometimes they're never so light in an ecumenical council, or maybe they were, but it was something, most of them would remain into these into the local churches preserved, and remaining unused, also because some of them were so much so much evidently false and imaginative that that they they were blatantly, they couldn't be even asked out of a certain context at least, and they wouldn't be believed. Well, the donation of Constantine was born exactly like that. And initially, this diplom that was thought to have been written in Rome in an uncertain date, and it was already understood that it was from the second half of the 8th century. And it was initially produced, however, we know that there was this idea that was created at the time of Pope Paul I, in fact, that was Pope from 757 to 767, but on paleographical and studies and our observation, we tend to say today that it could be into the mid of the 9th century. It could have been written into the mid of the 9th century, and the text would have been elaborated in the abbeys of Saint-Denis or Corbie. So into the northeast of France, by the way, quite close in certain churches that were already building a great importance, a great idea of themselves to play also politically. So centers that were absolutely no naive nor unknown to certain falsifications. And this is a text, however, that was celebrating the glory of the Lateran Palace. The Lateran Palace obviously was, as we know, the palace where the Pope lived in Rome, close to the Basilica of St. John. That was the one that had been donated by Constantine to Pope Sylvester I, and that is the most important church of the entire Christianity even today. St. Peter came later. The cathedral seat of Rome is St. John Lateran. And at that time, Lateran was seen, even from a merely even architectonical point of view, as a symbol of the papal power. Also because the city of Rome was ruled by local aristocracies. The Pope obviously had a large importance in there, but let's say that the palace of the Lateran Palace, it really embodied the same papal power, and in the Lateran Palace, according to the donation of Constantine, the Emperor Constantine would have in fact emanated the same diplom. I'm using a terrible English this evening, but whatever. from the text of the donation, Constantine would have created in the same Lateran palace this diplom, which entrusted to the Roman pontiffs every power over Rome, listen well, Italy, and more generally all over the western regions of the empire. So you can understand how crazy that was. The the popes had asked to the Carolingians to have just a power all over Italy. That was already something incredible that obviously couldn't be met as a request. The donation of Constantine was asking, something like the rule, the papal rule all over the Western, the Western Empire that at that time wasn't even united, because the Carolingian Empire stopped with the Channel, with the Pyrenees, and even in Italy that it didn't reach up to a certain point in the south. So it was something completely disconnected with reality. But this is how we see that. It wasn't much of the fact of saying, this is a true document. It was just a document that was waived, and in a way, look, we have this that says even that the Pope has the power all over the Western Western Europe. So you, as metropolits, you have to give up at least and accepting popes as your superiors, not just like another metropolite like you. So this is obviously, as we have said, it's a hyperbole. I mean, it's not something you could obviously believe. So. But such hyperbolical donation wasn't in fact used, as we were saying, in any Carolingian, in any demand that the papacy made towards the Carolingians. But considering the importance of the Pseudo-Isidorian collection of Decretals, that was really what mattered, because obviously these Decretals, there was a huge quantity of them, but obviously according to where they were written, by whom, and which spread they would have, because this is really based on how things happened at that time. They would become very, very influential, and this pushed, obviously, as we were saying, towards the celebration of the Church of Rome. And in a moment that was the second half of the 9th century, in which there were extremely important popes like Nicholas the First, this should be named, and John the Eighth, that were extremely active popes in every political and ecclesiastical sector of Christianity, and who were incidentally in contact with some of the most important metropolitic seats, and in particular with the one of the of Rheims, especially with the Archbishop Ingmar of Rheims, that was extremely sensible to the needs of government of ecclesiastical provinces, and who was determined to obtain the obedience of those suffragan bishops, and being at the same time very busy, doctrinally speaking, within the discussion of the problem of these institutions, meaning that he was pushing instead for a very different view compared to the one the popes were trying to build, that strengthened instead the importance of metropolitic power. Obviously, Ingmar of Rheims was a great figure. We know, what metropolitic power in that sense could mean. It was a very strong power on the local churches, on local dioceses, and there was the real problem at that point is that the church, so fragmented as it was, so still formally, without a single head like it was, had to define collectively, because that gave prestige eventually to the ecumenical councils, or maybe more restricted councils, but still very large, like the one that could happen within the Carolingian Empire, would give a different order, different organization. So it's extremely meaningful that the donation of Constantine was created in such context, a context in which the popes were really on the rise, from a perspective of creating a worldly power, of growing their own influence over the world Western world, the world of Western Church, and local churches and local archbishops, instead trying to preserve their own prestige and their own prerogatives, pastoral prerogatives, because this is also what it was about. That theoretically, metropolitic power was a positive thing. A hierarchy. The necessity of hierarchy is expressed quite clearly since the letters of Saint Paul. You can't organize the church if there is not someone who is at the top and manages and tries, obviously, and it is obvious a community has to be guided in a certain way. What the popes, however, were saying, which was revolutionary for that time. It wasn't something that was born at that time, but it was still very, very hidden in the very local seats where this happened, because it wasn't just Rome asking for that. Even in Spain, in Toledo, there was something similar that eventually was erased by the Arab conquest. But all these various ecclesiastical centers were trying to increase their own prestige, ideologically speaking. Well, Rome had the cards, had very good cards to play, and trying to establish her own preeminence in the ecclesiastical hierarchy from a very political point of view all over the metropolitic seats. And that tells you so much also about the background of these decretals that were and how messy things were really at that time. How there wasn't any stable frame within which orienting such ecclesiastical to settle such ecclesiastical problems, questions that were arising with an empire like the Carolingian one that was obviously aiming and pushing for giving the church a structure and an order. And this is bit by bit what the papal what the Roman Church was trying, how it progressively rose to power, and how she started determining, the affairs in Western Christianity, because it was something that she wasn't allowed, originally speaking, to do, because nobody had really done. The donation is fake. Nobody had granted these very privileges, but they were in the condition of claiming them, which is really what's important. And I really don't think that people at the time would actually believe in such decretals. We know that there were people who were obviously questioning them, because they knew how things worked. I mean, these same archbishops and these same kings were doing the same exact thing. There were so many fake documents at that time. It was just more a bit of a matter of prestige of who was creating these fakes, rather than, in fact, the reliability of these same documents. And the fact that the donation of Constantine wasn't eventually so determining in and this success of the Roman Church, that eventually in the 13th century had the political situation of Europe in her own hands, really tells you how, it were many little things that were used all together to achieve that. And the donation of Constantine probably played its part, but it wasn't really a determining factor, something that would be taken as a pillar of, of papal, ideology, in front of, of a church that of other churches that were doing basically the same exact, that were using the same exact strategy and faking documents. And by the way, it's famous that the donation of Constantine would be recognized as a fake by the same Catholic priest and humanist Lorenzo Valla in the 15th century, that obviously read this thing and said, this is full of historical mistakes. It's completely out of context. It's fake. So it was something practically settled within the same Catholic Church, and it didn't have any big consequence overall. Obviously, at that time, it was known, but it was evidently known because in many other things, that for instance, the holy relics scattered all over Europe of so many saints were so many at that point that there were like 10 different 10 the skulls of the same saint scattered all over Europe. I mean, there were a lot of things that probably in the medieval world, but also in our world as well, that are fake, but people are prone to believe them innocently, by knowing that it's fake, but still, it makes part of tradition, and that's how we have to see that. We don't have to think it as lawyers by saying, oh, this is fake and now you have to respond to that. No, because that's how the world worked at that time, so there is really nothing to be surprised of. And this is the main point I wanted to make, that sometimes we judge past events with a modern perspective that really doesn't make sense, because you can't judge something out of context. I mean, you can do that, but what's the meaning at that point? You can correct people that still believe to that in a wrong way, for instance, but once you said, this is fake, and yeah, but you don't know why it was done and why it had been faked, you're basically just laughing at nothing, because it means you don't know the very reason and the very purpose of these documents that was otherwise quite clever for that time, and not because people were stupid, but because probably were more intelligent than us, and at that time knew how to play their cards in a way that today embarrasses us for the way we are not able to play well our own cards. So with this note, I leave you. I hope you liked this video. I'm sorry, it was a bit of a mess, even linguistically speaking. I hope it didn't sound too bad. If you like this video, please leave a like or share it, which would be best. Otherwise, leave a comment on an email, and if you want a personalized video on a topic, obviously I have to consider first, please propose to me, because I might make a personalized video just for you. So I thank you once again for watching, and I wish you a nice time, and see you to the next time. Bye.